So last year I asked you guys if you wanted me to talk about more things from real-world spaceflight, and overwhelmingly the comment section said yes, so today we're going to dive into spaceflight in real life. And I picked a fairly interesting topic today. Today we're going to discuss the Soyuz spacecraft, which isn't brand new, it isn't cutting edge, but it's got some interesting ties to history and an interesting tie to something I actually own. So today let's discuss how the Soyuz spacecraft works, and at the end of this video, I'll show you an actual piece of a Soyuz spacecraft that went to space. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So the Soyuz spacecraft is the primary workhorse manned spacecraft for the Russian and, in the past, Soviet space programs, and it played a key role stretching all the way back to the late 60s. And so I do want to focus primarily on how the Soyuz works, but I definitely want to give some context, so we'll start out with a brief history of the Soyuz program, how it got started, and how it got to where it is today. So the Soyuz spacecraft was designed in the 60s within the Soviet Union as a counterpart to the American Apollo program. It was designed to carry Soviet cosmonauts to the moon, with a lunar variant being designed to take part in their moon program, and an orbital variant being designed to allow their astronauts, their cosmonauts, to train in low Earth orbit before actually venturing off to the moon. And, well, the lunar variant never really saw the spotlight of history, having never had a working launch vehicle to send it to the moon. The orbital variant did, ultimately finding its way into the Soviet space station program, and serving as the main ferry spacecraft to carry cosmonauts to and from Soviet space stations, basically starting in the early 70s with Salyut 1. Throughout the 70s and the 80s, the Soyuz spacecrafts would service the Salyut and then Mir space stations, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of the Russian Federation, it filled a similar role within Roscosmos, Russia's space agency, where it would serve as the primary shuttle to and from Mir. With the start of the International Space Station program, it became the primary shuttle for Russian cosmonauts and American astronauts, as well as astronauts from other participating nations, to get to and from the International Space Station, where it continues to serve to this day. Now, it's worth noting that the Russian Federation is technically working on a replacement for it, but they've been working on that replacement for a while, and I don't see it being ready to fly realistically anytime soon. So now that we have a vague idea of the history of the Soyuz spacecraft, and there's a long and fascinating history that I'd love to dive into, but we have a fairly limited amount of time today, let's talk about how this spacecraft works. So the Soyuz spacecraft launches on top of the Soyuz rocket, a rocket that is named for its primary payload, which is the Soyuz spacecraft. It is derived from the R-7 missile, which was the first ICBM ever deployed, and was used to launch Sputnik. This rocket consisted of 4 strap-on boosters, technically labeled the first stage, a core stage, technically labeled the second stage. I know that feels weird to us in the United States, but that's the way the Russians label it, and a second stage, which is technically labeled the third stage. On top of that is the spacecraft inside of a payload fairing with a launch abort system on top. But we're not going to focus as much on the rocket today because I want to focus on the spacecraft itself, and to help demonstrate that, I actually have a little model of a Soyuz here. So the Soyuz spacecraft ultimately has one way in or out of the spacecraft once it makes it to orbit, and that's this docking node at the front of the vehicle, which is used to dock and undock with whatever space station it's visiting, or whatever vehicle in orbit it's visiting. It is worth noting that there actually is a second hatch on the orbital module located right here on the front, which is primarily used for ingress during the crew boarding the spacecraft on the launch pad. It was also used as an airlock in the early days of the Soviet space program, where they would depressurize the orbital module, the spherical part up here, and then they could send their crew members on EVAs. So the spacecraft can ultimately be broken up into 3 components: the orbital module, the descent module, and the service module. And we'll start right here in the middle with the descent module. It's basically what you think of when you think of a space capsule. Tight, cramped space with seats and a lot of controls. From here, the crew can monitor and operate the spacecraft's activities, and it's where they sit during launch and landing. But when they get in space, it's a very tight amount of room. It's very cramped for 2 or 3 people, depending on which version of the Soyuz you're on. So this orbital module basically provides more space for the crew to exist in. That also includes a small kitchen and a bathroom for flights that would take a decent amount of time to get to wherever they're going. Now, while Soyuz flights to the International Space Station nowadays take only a few hours, they used to take 2 days, and that's a long time to be crammed up in this little tin can. Now let's talk about the service module at the bottom, which is where these big solar panels are. That contains basically everything the ship needs to run, minus space for the crew. So that's your batteries, your fuel, your power generation being the solar panels, and the ship's primary orbital maneuvering thruster, the engine that allows it to maneuver around in space, not counting the the reaction control thrusters, which are scattered around the ship, which are used to help orient the vessel. So now that we know what each of these components do, let's talk about what a standard Soyuz flight would look like. So you'd launch, once you detach from the rocket, the solar panels are unfolded, because during launch they're folded up against the side of the vehicle to help it fit in the fairing. And now with the spacecraft free-floating in space, it makes its way to wherever it's going, the International Space Station or Mir or whatever it's docking with. Once it docks with that space station using, once again, this docking port at the front, it can sit up there for up to 6 months before having to be cycled back to Earth. There it can serve as a lifeboat in the event of an emergency and a ride home for the crew that took it into space. When it's time to come home, though, that's when things get really interesting. The Soyuz undocks from the space station using a set of springs located in the metal ring around the docking port and slowly withdraws from the whatever it docked with, the space station or whatnot. After it's a sufficient distance away from the space station, they begin what's called the deorbit process, where they begin to prepare to come home. And this has changed a bit throughout history. So let's start where it began, the very early Soyuz days. So these 3 segments do not all come back. I'm just going to tell you that right now. Of these 3 segments, only one of these makes it home to Earth. So nowadays, they'll do what's called a deorbit burn, where they light up the engine here, and it slows the spacecraft down enough where it falls into the atmosphere. And then they separate all 3 components. However, during the early days of the Soyuz program, they would actually separate the orbital module first, and then do the deorbit burn, and then separate the service module. But either way, nowadays all 3 parts stay attached, and then after that deorbit burn, they separate, leaving just the descent module, now falling back into Earth's atmosphere. The descent module has a heat shield on the bottom, where that magnet is that was holding my model together, but the whole vehicle is coated in a heat-resistant material designed to help it survive reentry. As the vehicle screams through the atmosphere, the vehicle experiences what's called a plasma blackout, where they lose radio communication with the ground for a few minutes. When they come out of that blackout, they have made it through the fieriest part of reentry and are now just free-falling toward Earth's surface. As the freefall continues, the parachute is deployed, and it's deployed via a panel on the side of the spacecraft, which is blown off. This panel is held on with explosive bolts, and once the parachutes are ready to be deployed, one panel blows off and the drogue parachute deploys, a small parachute which begins slowing the spacecraft down before a main parachute can be deployed, which finishes the job of slowing the spacecraft to its descent speed. At that point, the spacecraft is now descending under a large parachute, and the heat shield then falls away. It's no longer needed, and underneath it is a set of what are called soft landing engines, because right as the spacecraft is about to touch down on the ground, those engines are fired to provide a last little bit of cushion before the spacecraft actually touches down on the steppes of Kazakhstan, because unlike American capsules, it's not landing in the water, they're landing in the Kazakh desert. Once the spacecraft is finally on the ground, a recovery team, which has been circling in nearby helicopters or waiting in nearby vehicles, pull up and extract the crew from the capsule, and usually within half an hour of landing, the crew are out and about. But I want to talk a little bit more about the parachutes, because that's where my little show and tell here comes in. So the parachutes are under these big metal panels that are held on by explosive bolts. But to get those explosive bolts in, the Soviets had to be able to screw those bolts in from outside of the spacecraft. So they had to make a plug that fits over those bolts. And this is a plug from one of those bolts on one of those parachute panels from a Soyuz spacecraft that flew in the late 60s, that actually did carry crew members to space and safely back to Earth. And that is a fascinating story, the story of the flight that this piece of space history is from, and I would love to cover it. So later this week, I'm going to make a video all about the mission that this plug flew on and the historical role it played in the Soviet Union's journey to the moon and the Soyuz program itself. So stick around for that. But if you'd like to learn more about the Soviet moon program, I'll leave a link up here to a video I made a while back about why the for all mankind scenario of the Soviets actually landing on the moon doesn't make a ton of sense. And I'm sure I'll dive deeper into the Soviet moon program in the future, but for now that's the best I got. And I'd like to let me know down in the comments what you think of Soyuz's history. Do you think it's time to retire this spacecraft, or do you think it's proven itself reliable and should stick around at least as a backup once its replacement is finally ready to fly? And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in science fiction or in a real-world spaceflight, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.